I remember very vividly the day that Marvel and Netflix announced that they were doing 4 TV shows that would lead to a Defenders miniseries. The whole idea of doing stuff like Luke Cage and Iron Fist on TV was, or at least movies or something with them, had been in the works for a while, but then getting the official announcement that they were doing that, and Jessica Jones and Daredevil, that was something special. That was exciting, and because it was Marvel, and because they've made so many other things, we trusted that it was going to happen. They always do a really good job of keeping their word, as opposed to some other stuff we've seen, like with DC, where they cast and had an entire written Justice League movie, and then they just dropped it. And so it was exciting. And then I remember very vividly the day Daredevil came out, and I got up 3 a.m., watched the whole thing on a 13-hour binge, and it was phenomenal. Then I did the same thing for Jessica Jones, and here we are today on March 18th, 2016. The second season of Daredevil has just come out, and I did the exact same thing. Woke up 3 a.m., started binge watching it 13 hours straight, took one break to get breakfast, and that's it. I don't know where to begin with this. If you were following me on Facebook or Twitter, then you know the evolution of my experience with this. So let me front load this with some of the stuff I really want to talk about. So Stephen S. DeKnight left the show after the first season. He's no longer showrunner. Drew Goddard did some consulting on it. He's got an executive producer credit. He helped out with it, but he didn't really run the show this time either. He didn't write any episodes like he did for... He wrote the first 2 episodes for season 1. He didn't do anything here, but he was involved somewhat. DeKnight didn't have anything to do with it, and a couple of the writers from the first season that wrote some of the best episodes, like Rabbit in a Snowstorm, were responsible for show running this time around. And so naturally everyone was a little bit worried because we didn't have Goddard, we didn't have DeKnight, and those guys are phenomenal writers. So it must hurt to lose them. And from the way this season opened, it doesn't seem like that's an issue. Because the way this season opens, it's like they never left. It's like everything just kept going. It's like everything was just full steam ahead. It's like season 1 and 2 were just one long season, and we had to wait in between because it was a hiatus. It doesn't feel like a separate story. It just feels like continuation. And that was exciting. That was great. The first episode opens really, really well, and I like everything that's happening for the most part all the way throughout the series. There were 2 big additions this time around. There's Punisher and there's Elektra. And we saw from the trailers that the Hand was going to be involved. The Hand is involved, and I'll talk about all of that individually. I'll talk about some of the themes individually. This might actually turn out to be a pretty long review, but there will be no spoilers because we're doing a full spoiler cast in a couple of weeks anyway, so don't worry about that. So right from the get-go, it felt like this was going to be fantastic, and for a while it really, really was. Captain Logan and I were talking a little bit about this when we did the commentary for the first episode of the series, and I kept expecting a tonal shift, and I think for the most part I was right. The show does feel a little bit different, not because of the writing team, but just because of the way the season finale for season 1 ended, just the way that final episode worked things out with Kingpin and with Matt Murdock and Daredevil getting his costume. It just became a different thing afterwards. And so there's more costumed action in this. It feels a lot more superhero. The first season is very vigilante art house, and this is not. This is very superhero, but it's just as violent. Actually, that's one thing I do want to mention before I forget about it. First season is really, really tense. First season has lots of brutal fights. It's not gory, though, right? Like, there's a couple of scenes here and there, like when Wilson Fisk decapitates a guy with a car door, and there's some moments here and there where, like, you see someone's bone, and there's a little bit of blood, but, like, as violent and as gritty as it is, it's not gory. You're not staring into anything disgusting for more than, like, a half second. This season changes that. This season is about escalation. It's Dark Knight in that way. This season is about looking into something that we aren't necessarily prepared to look into, especially with the Punisher. And so you do get a lot more blood. You do get a lot more violence. The fights are not only more brutal, they're more cinematic, they're more visceral, there's a different kind of feel to everything because things have changed, because Matt Murdock as Daredevil has evolved Hell's Kitchen, and he's created a new social dynamic, and he's fighting in a different way. He means something different than what he did in the first season, and so visually all of that's conveyed really, really well. And it's not, for me at least, it's not bad. For me, it's not a gratuitous set of violence. I think it works. I think it's all there thematically. I don't have a weak stomach. I can take a lot of the blood and gore pretty well. But if you were in any way uncomfortable with the first season at all, if you were uncomfortable with Jessica Jones at all, you might want to be wary of this just a little bit, because it ramps it up. It ramps it up above Jessica Jones. It ramps it up above Daredevil. And I thought Jessica Jones was a pretty high step up, even not necessarily with gore, but just the thematic ideas that made situations tenser. This is really, really tense stuff. This is really bloody stuff. So just be wary of that. It really earns its rating. And the fight scenes, I will mention, they look incredible. They looked really great in the first season too, but you had the thing in Cutman. You had that hallway fight that everyone talked about, that everyone loved. Well, third episode of the season's got another one of those tracking shot fight scenes, and it blows Cutman out of the water. It's so good. It's absolutely beautifully choreographed. It's absolutely beautifully shot. It's beautifully acted. Everything with the way these characters fight and how they get tired and the damage they take on is all fantastic. It's the little details in the season that really shine. For example, you'll see the Punisher take a blow to the face early on, and then for the whole season, that bruise is healing. Sometimes it gets worse, sometimes it gets better, sometimes the injuries get exacerbated, sometimes they don't. People really feel alive. There's so much more impact to these kinds of things. There's a point where a character hurts his mouth, and then a couple episodes later, you see that character eating, and he has to stop because the cut in his mouth starts hurting again. It's really cool how they're able to keep track of all that and make it feel real. And the season covers a good bit of time, but it never jumps ahead. It never feels like it's like it never feels like it's been a massive gap so that everyone's injuries are just magically healed. The first season had lots of points where Matt Murdock was ridiculously brutalized, where he was just dripping blood all over the place, where he could barely get up, and it took a couple episodes for him to get back on his feet, but only a couple episodes. This season takes an even more realistic route, where if someone gets hurt, they're hurt for most of the season, and that's really cool. And Karen Page has a lot more to do. She had a lot to do in the first season, but here she has a lot to do, and a lot of it has to do with some of the natural progressions we had from the first season. I don't want to spoil anything, obviously, but where we left her character and who she was involved with, and the kind of plot that we started with her in the first season, all of it gets taken to a very logical extreme here. What she does, who she associates with, all that stuff's handled extremely naturally. There's some stuff with Foggy and Matt that is front-loaded and then becomes sort of the tone for the whole season. And a lot of that stuff's set up at the end of the first season, and that all builds to a very, very strong conclusion. All the interpersonal relationships between Matt, Karen, and Foggy are fantastic. All of them feel natural. All of them feel like they came from a place we understood in the first season. If you've seen the first season a couple of times, you'll notice a lot of callbacks. You'll notice a lot of line deliveries that are similar. You notice even stuff from the trailer where Punisher says, "You're a half measure and you're a coward," and those lines come from season 1, where Matt was called out on several occasions. And so that kind of continuity is fantastic. And then also, speaking of continuity, there are a couple of Jessica Jones references in this season. The first season of Jessica Jones had moments where it acknowledged Daredevil existed in that universe, mostly because Rosario Dawson was in the end of that season. Here, it's a lot more direct, and so I like that this is finally building. It's kind of been worrying to me that Daredevil did so well, and then immediately got greenlit for a second season, then Jessica Jones came out, and so if all 4 of these shows are supposed to build to the Defenders, then you'd have to assume their stories have to be very tightly kept. So if you keep greenlighting seasons, you have to wonder how much they have to rework how Defenders is going, but it really feels like it's in the same universe now, and it feels like it's earned that and it's doing it naturally. I know Ian Sid Part 2, he and I talk about this every now and then. He says that one of his issues with Daredevil is, the first season at least, is that until you get to the fight with Nobu in I want to say it's the 8th or ninth episode, I'm not sure off the top of my head, it doesn't feel like it's part of the MCU, and then it just suddenly does that. It just suddenly shifts tones for him. And I didn't completely agree with that. I saw where he was coming from, though. I can understand that complaint. And if you have that complaint at all, if you have that reservation of Daredevil doesn't feel like it belongs in the MCU, this season, that's not a problem at all anymore. It feels like a superhero show. There were things in this season that are extremely comic book. It absolutely belongs in that universe, especially when you pair it with some of the crazy stuff that happens at the end of Jessica Jones. So that's not a problem. And then, speaking of comic book, one of the best things about this season is that it feels like you're reading a run on Daredevil. It's only 13 episodes, but every episode feels like it's 2 or 3 issues long. Weirdly enough, the first season feels very Bendis, and this season feels very Frank Miller. And I don't just mean that in the characters that are involved, because obviously Frank Miller did a great story with The Punisher, Frank Miller did a great story, Frank Miller did everything great with Elektra. And so you think naturally you would feel more Frank Miller. No, I don't just mean the characters, I don't just mean some of the situations. I mean, like, Frank Miller has certain devices, certain tropes, certain things that are constant symbols throughout all of his work that are in this show. This is not giving away too much, but in almost everything he writes, he has this obsession with the heat. This idea that when it gets warmer, his stories start to unfold. And that's in this season. He does stuff like that. This season captures the way Frank Miller writes really well. And in places, it really feels like his kind of melodrama, and I like that a lot. It's interesting to see that in a reverse order. Like, usually, in your mind, it's Miller to Bendis as far as Daredevil's evolution as a character goes. If you just watch this series, then it's Bendis to Miller. But it works, just tonally, it's a very natural thing, and because both of those writers did so much for that character, it feels completely earned, and it feels like you're reading Daredevil through and through. Obviously, they do stuff that only a TV show can do, and so it validates itself in that way, but it still gives me the same experience as if I was just holding an epic collection of Miller's work, or Bendis' work, or Brubaker's work. I think that's fantastic. It handles the superhero stuff a lot better than the first season did, and the first season did a great job with it, but here he really feels like comic book Daredevil. It really feels like I'm immersed in that comic book world again, and it captures that in-between quality Daredevil. If you watch the commentary for the first episode that Captain Logan and I did, we talk about this thing with Daredevil where reading him, there is this weird in-between feeling. There's this feeling, this thing you can't really encapsulate, but because he's blind, and because of the way the art works, and because of the way the character is written, there's some weird aesthetic layer on top of Daredevil that makes him different from any other superhero. And the first season of that show had that, and this season has that as well. And I love that. I love that addictive quality. Just aesthetically, the way the show is put together and looks, and it's great. Speaking of aesthetics, though, because I did do that analysis, I keep getting into really good segues for my next points, and I'm not doing that on purpose, I swear. But speaking of aesthetics, I did my analysis on Daredevil, the first season, on aesthetic ethics in Daredevil, and my focus on that was the way that series was using art to convey its themes, to convey its characters, to convey its morality. And there's nothing in this season like art. There's no one particular motif that's constantly going throughout that becomes the symbol for everything the season is trying to say. There's no clear intellectual reference that these writers are pulling from. The posters for the season did invoke some art here and there. There are points in certain episodes where I feel like I recognize shots as some paintings, but never intentionally. It's always just me kind of looking for that because I like to analyzing that part of the first season so much. But that's not a criticism. I think that's actually welcome and earned. And because it's more superhero this time, it asks more classic superhero questions. So leading into that, we'll talk about the last two major things, which lead into everything I love about the season and everything I don't like about the season. So like I said, I was going to front load it. Let's talk about The Punisher. I'm not a guy that likes The Punisher. I've read Punisher Max. I've read the other one on Punisher that Garth has had. I've read some stuff with Ultimate Punisher. I've read some stuff from 80s Punisher, 90s Punisher. I read... there's a mini that Frank Miller did a long time ago that I can't remember what that was called or when that came out that I read at one point. But I've read a good bit of Punisher, but I've never liked that character. No matter how good the stories are, I always kind of get bored by him. And then this show happened, and that first 4 episode arc dealing with the Punisher's history and his conflict with Daredevil and his methodology and all of that is phenomenal. I fell in love with that character. John Berthol, I think that's how you pronounce his last name. I'm not sure off the top of my head. But that actor, as Frank Castle, is perfect. He's so good. He's so intense. His dialogue is fantastic. His mannerisms are fantastic. Everything they do with him on the military motifs and the ethical issues and the family stuff, it all really hits hard. There is a point in episode 4 by the end of it where Frank Castle has a really, really great speech to Matt Murdock, and it's incredible. It's emotional. It's gut wrenching. It's great stuff. They knew how to craft this character from the ground up. They knew exactly what they were doing with him ethically. They knew exactly what they were doing with him, paralleling to Matt's character. They knew what they were doing with him visually, and just the acting job is incredible. He's so good. I can't even put into words how good he is in the role. I really, really love it. I'm a big fan of Thomas Jane Punisher. Mostly because that's a movie my dad and I watch a lot together, even though it's not a perfect movie. And as much as I love Thomas Jane as Punisher, I think this technically is a lot better. And the more I rewatch this, I'm sure it's going to work more and more for me. And part of what I found so interesting about this is you do the really classic philosophical argument here where Daredevil doesn't kill, Punisher kills. So is it a deontological life's inherent value thing versus a consequentialist, the utilitarian kind of perspective where it's all about the consequence of these actions? And they have this interesting motif going where one of the issues with a consequentialist perspective, one of the issues with saying that if I kill this criminal, it discourages crime, is that you don't know the future. So you can never know for certain whether or not killing crime discourages crime. And so that's always a classic argument against utilitarianism, against consequentialism as a whole. And they bring that up in parts. But they also bring up the idea that, okay, you can have this inherent idealistic belief in killing is wrong, but look at how detrimental that is. Look at how problematic that is. Look at how nearly impossible, if not completely impossible, that is. And even if you read Kant, if you read any sort of deontological philosophy, if you read Batman, you realize that what he does, as much as it's trying to build to a better world, in the practical sense, it doesn't really work. And it gets to you on an emotional core, when it talks about that. When it attacks deontology, it attacks you personally. When it attacks utilitarianism, it attacks your ideology. It does a really good job of balancing back and forth those arguments, and it's handled really uniquely, because it's all about whether or not the system works. It's all about whether the justice system is actually something that can be salvaged, and they do a Dark Knight thing, kind of, and it brings up some really interesting questions about the nature of justice and the nature of practical searches for justice versus idealistic searches. And there's some courtroom drama that deals with that and sort of the human cost, the psychological cost. It's not just a Kant versus John Stuart Mill argument that most of these things turn into. It's Sartrean, it's Simone de Beauvoir kind of style, it's Nietzschean. Like, it's really going at this from every possible angle. And you can see the writers constantly putting themselves in boxes and forcing themselves to get out, and it really works on that thematic moral level, and I love all of that. And then it falls apart. And then the season, then I don't know what happens, and then it stops. I don't know how else to describe it. It stops. I will rewatch this. I'm definitely going to rewatch this. We're going to do the spoiler cast. I'm going to watch this at least one more time before we do that. I'm going to probably watch it a couple times afterwards. But the other thing, the other character that gets thrown into the mix of this, that deals with some of that stuff thematically, that ties in some of the Punisher stuff, is Elektra. And I don't think Elektra works at all. I think Elektra is the root of every problem in the season. I think Elektra unravels pretty much everything that happens by the end of the season. There's a couple of things in the action sequences in the last episode that are just there for action and it completely destroys some of the thematic stuff we've been doing for 2 full seasons. There's a character arc, there is a progression, there's a relationship element to Matt Murdock's character that involves Elektra that ultimately doesn't seem to mean anything or make any kind of sense. The stuff with the hand just, it doesn't work. It feels like tacked on action that was the B plot that somehow became the A plot over the Punisher stuff, and it becomes really wonky. It becomes really unbalanced. The season starts off with a bang. Literally, the first episode's called Bang. The season starts off with a bang, and then it just fizzles out when you deal with the Elektra stuff and when you deal with the stuff with the hand. And I can't really talk about it without spoiling anything, but part of my problem is a lot of these interesting thematic elements, a lot of these interesting character elements just don't get resolutions. Matt has a very specific character arc throughout this. Matt has this constant need to devote everything into his quest, and he keeps losing people over it. And there's a cliffhanger-esque moment by the end that could be the resolution to his character arc, but a lot of that stuff's developed through Elektra, and it doesn't feel like Matt Murdock ever actually learns his lesson by the end of it. There's a lot of stuff here that's attempted to be wrapped up really quickly, and I feel like ultimately they should have just waited to use the hand for the Defenders, made it feel like a different thing, made it work with more characters, made it work independently of what they were doing with the Punisher, because as much as they try to rope those two storylines together, they just don't gel. And it's sad because the actress that plays Elektra is great. Scott Glenn as Stick is fantastic. A couple of the recurring characters in some of the hand fight scenes are incredible on technical levels, but you can't open your series, or you can't open your season, well, both your series and your season, if you think about how season 1 opens, you can't open it on this very basic idea of relationships, of humanity, of weakness, of emotional cores that get driven in various directions by various philosophies and various social constructs. You can't make your show about emotional roots and explore them as thoroughly as you do, only to somehow finagle it to make it about the action by the end. And it's really kind of disappointing. I don't really understand the hand by the end of this. The hand has the same problem that the League of Assassins have in Arrow and Spectre, the organization, has in Spectre. What they want, their motivations, their methodology, their relationship to the stuff Matt's dealing with, and the relationship to, at least thematically, to the Punisher stuff, all of that just kind of feels shallow. And considering what this show has been able to do with characters like the Punisher, with characters like Karen Page, with stuff in the first season with Wilson Fisk, what this show has been good at feels like it just gets thrown out the window. It feels like a different show. There is a very distinct point, and I can't point it out now because spoilers, but I'll do it in the spoiler cast. There is a point about halfway through the season where it feels like something stopped and a new showrunner took over and everything changes. And it's extremely clear when you get to it. And for me, I was kind of putting myself through a little bit of denial of, no, this is going to go somewhere. This is going to go somewhere. This is all going to build. This is all going to coalesce in one great finale, and it doesn't. And let me be clear, the stuff with Foggy, the stuff with Karen, all of that really works. The stuff with Punisher, until about episode 11, it works incredibly. By episode 12 and 13, it stops. But by episode 11, it works incredibly. The stuff with Matt Murdock, until about episode 11, works incredibly. It's Elektra that never really works. It's those last 2 episodes that become problematic, and it's where things start to unravel, and where the twists and turns and the grander scale of the season start making everything else crumble. And it's really a shame. The only other thing I'll mention is when the trailer first came out, myself and some other people were talking about how it's very, very Batman. And it still is. It's very Dark Knight. There's a very Dark Knight-esque plot point very early on. It's all about escalation. And there's even certain scenes, there's even certain things Daredevil does and says that all you do is replace the costume and it's a Batman scene. The exact same context, the exact same dialogue delivery, the exact same shoot. Just keep everything exactly the same and switch the costumes and it's a Batman scene. And that's not really a problem. It's just interesting that they lift the material of Batman as much as they do. And in places it's okay because a lot of the similarities just come from the fact that Batman and Daredevil are similar characters. And so it's not really an issue the way it is for Daredevil, or not for Daredevil. It's not really an issue the same way it is for Arrow, where Arrow is based on Green Arrow, doesn't really take much from Green Arrow, and is just a Batman wannabe show. This is very much a Daredevil show that reminds us of how similar Batman and Daredevil can be, which is funny now that Ben Affleck has played both of them. So, yeah, this season I don't know how to feel about it because I love so much about it. I think it's so good for so long. And then you get to those last couple episodes and I think it just falls apart. I'm going to have to rewatch it. I'm going to have to talk about it with a couple of people. I'm going to be interested to see what people think of the comments. Because I'm having trouble putting everything I'm thinking into words right now. Just because there's no subtext, I guess. I've been looking through the season with a magnifying glass all the way through, and I kept getting rewarded for it. I kept seeing little things over and over again, building and building and being this incredible thematic through line, and then you get to a point that all of it disappears. Just all of it disappears, and it becomes about very particular circumstances and action scenes before it becomes about trying to tell us something. And I don't know, that's problematic. The other thing I'll say is that there may be some implicit social commentary here and there, but it's very even. It doesn't really takes one side or the other. I'm going to save some of that for the spoiler cast because I don't want to mention anything specifically. But the season is very clearly aware of its subject matter and of its brutality and of what it's trying to say for the most part. And so I guess be wary of some of that because there are lots of things here where you blink and you miss it, and I'm hoping that's what happens when I go back and watch those last two episodes where I just miss something great. But it's really densely put together. It's really well made overall. I think it is a step down from season one, and I don't think it's as good as Jessica Jones. I still think Jessica Jones is the best these shows have been. Daredevil season 1 is still brilliant. Jessica Jones is even better, and Daredevil season 2, it's a little bit weaker. I'm not sure how much weaker, but I guess that's just something we're going to have to figure out as it ages. So thanks everybody for watching. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, whether you agree or disagree with anything I said. And let me know what your hopes are for Season 3 of the show and for Defenders and all of these shows on Netflix going forward. Thanks everybody for watching, and I'll see you next time.